Okay, now it's okay, right?
Yeah, it's okay.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. We will discuss Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi, inshallah. In the previous classes, we discussed Hasan ibn Sabit and then Ibn Hazm. This is our third author, Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi. Before I discuss Rumi's work, I want to share with you one Quranic verse. This we need to bear in mind when we study Rumi's poetry especially. Allah says in the Quran, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, in ja'akum fasiqun binaba'in fatabayyan. O you who believe, if any iniquitous person comes to you with a piece of information, you use your discernment and investigate, lest you hurt people unwittingly and afterwards be filled with remorse for what you have done. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we need to be mindful of the source of information. When we receive a piece of information, we need to investigate whether the source is authentic or not, whether the source is reliable or not. So this particular verse is relevant to Rumi studies. I will tell you in a minute why. Now I want to share with you a quote from Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian writer who died in 2013. Chinua Achebe said in a speech he gave in 1973, he said, in our discussion yesterday, Professor Emily Snyder reminded us that politics was always present in literature and gave examples from Dante to Eliot. So what Chinua Achebe says is that literature has always been full of politics. Literature is not a neutral subject. It has politics inherent in it. Even if some writers do not bring in politics in their writing, other people do. So literature is rarely free of politics. So we need to bear these two statements in mind. Number one, Allah says, when an iniquitous person comes to you with a piece of information, then you investigate. And then Chinua Achebe says that literature is full of politics. Now, why I have said it will be clearer. Why I have quoted these two statements will be clearer in a minute, inshallah. Let us discuss Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi, his origin, his name, and the word Rumi a bit. He was born in a place called Balkh. Balkh is in today's Afghanistan. He was born in 1207 in a place called Balkh, what is now in Afghanistan. At that time, Balkh and Afghanistan was under the Persian Empire. So that is why in Iran, people do not call him Rumi. They call him mainly Balkhi, Jalaluddin Balkhi, Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi, not Rumi. Now, how he got the title, got the name Rumi, there is another reason why he got this name Rumi. That is not because of his place of birth. That is because of his place of settlement, the place where he settled down at the end of towards the end of his life. He was born in Afghanistan, and then he migrated to Baghdad in Iraq, and then from Baghdad he went to Mecca. From Mecca he went to Damascus. From Damascus he went to Konya in Turkey, and there where he lived the rest of his life. So if we can look at that time, the spatio-temporal location of Rumi, where he lived and at what time he lived. That was the time when the Central Asia, the Muslim countries, were harassed by the Mongols from China. And we know that in 1258, Baghdad was invaded, and not a single human being was left alive. So the Mongols under under Halaku Khan invaded Baghdad. So that what I wanted to say is that the entire region was in turmoil. So that's why Rumi had to migrate from one place to another for security and also for the sake of knowledge. For example, he went to Damascus and Mecca for knowledge. Then finally, he settled down in Konya in Turkey. Now, Turkey at that time was under Byzantine Empire or Roman Empire. And we know that in Arabic, Byzantine Empire is called Rum. And we have a surah in the Quran, Surah Rum. Alif Lam Mim Ghulibatir Rum. So this Rum is Rumi. Since Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi settled down in Turkey, and Turkey at that time was under the Roman Empire, that is why he is known as Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi. Now his name was Muhammad, but his father added the word Jalaluddin later. Jalal means majesty. Jalaluddin means the majesty of religion. So his father added this prefix to his name later, but his original name was Muhammad. So now we have Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi or Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi, if you want to associate him with his place of origin. Now, unlike in today's world, scholars in the past were multifaceted. They were versatile in knowledge. And we call this kind of scholar polymath. So in that sense, Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi was a polymath. He knew many branches of knowledge. We regard him as a poet, but he was also a scholar of religion, a scholar of the Quran, a philosopher, so, and many other disciplines. Now, until the age of 35, Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi was an ordinary person. He lived a nondescript life. A nondescript life means not very popular, not very famous. He lived a very ordinary life. But something happened at the age of 35. And Ibn Battuta narrate one story. And we can get a clue from this story, how Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi's life changed after the age of 35. In his travelogue, Ibn Battuta relates a story. The story is regarding the composition of Rumi's Masnavi. So he said, Ibn Battuta says, in his youth, Rumi served as an instructor in a religious school. He was a teacher at a madrasa. One day while he was lecturing to his students, he noticed a sweetmeats vendor pass by. He saw a sweetmeat vendor passing by. After calling the man and sampling his words and looking at his goods, Rumi went off with him. That vendor is Shamsi Tabriz. So Shamsi Tabriz was a sweetmeat vendor, and Rumi was running a class, and he saw that sweetmeat vendor, Shamsi Tabriz. Rumi was fascinated by Shamsi Tabriz because Shamsi Tabriz was doing dhikr while he was selling his goods. Rumi went off with him. When his students subsequently tried to locate their instructor, their teacher, they discovered that he had completely vanished from the neighborhood. So they didn't find their teacher. They found that their teacher was completely vanished. After a few years, Rumi reappeared. And when he reappeared, he didn't come back as the previous Rumi. He came back as a totally different person. Now, whatever he says in poetry. And his students was fascinated by his poetic genius. So they started to writing down whatever he was saying. And the leading role was taken by Husam Shalabi, one of his students. They are the one who wrote down what Rumi was saying. So this is how we have his poetry, his Masnavi. So this is the story how Rumi's life changed, and we know that he has two main books. One is Diwani Shamsi Tabriz, and the other one is Masnavi and Masnavi Manavi. Now, if we look at Rumi's poetry, we see his poetry is full of love. Apparently, it may seem that his love is for Shamsi Tabriz, but if we look at his poetry with a critical mind, deeply, we'll find that this love is not actually for Shamsi Tabriz. This love is mainly for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is divine, a love for Allah, not a love for a human being. Unfortunately, some people, especially in the West, they interpret Rumi's love poetry in such a way that the divine element is missing. In other words, they separate or they take away his love for God from his poetry. In some cases, they will interpret his love as love between a man and woman. Or in other cases, they will interpret his love as love between him and Shamsi Tabriz. So in most cases, the element of love for Allah is missing in Western interpretation of Rumi's poetry. Now, if we look at the scholarship on Rumi in today's world, we will find that most of his works, most of his poetry has been translated, or the widely available translation that we see in everybody's hand is by Coleman Burks. Coleman Burks is a literature scholar. He was with the University of Georgia in America, and he is the one who presumably translated Rumi's work into English. There are other people who did before him, but unfortunately, Coleman Burke's translation has become widespread. Now, Coleman Burke does not read Persian. Coleman Burke does not understand Persian. Coleman Burke cannot write Persian. So he has no knowledge of Persian. So how he translated Rumi? What he did, he depended on other English translations, and then he interpolated his own ideas and distorted Rumi's message. there has been a great disservice to the work of Rumi because of this wrong translation by Colemanberg. So in Colemanberg's work, Rumi is not an Islamic scholar. He is not even a Muslim. He is simply a love poet, and the element of religiosity or the element of or Islamic elements are totally absent from Colemanberg's translation of Rumi. And I read an article by a woman called Rosina Ali, and she regards this as spiritual colonialism. What Colemanberg has done to Rumi amounts to spiritual colonialism. Now, I want to give you some examples how Colemanberg distorted the message of Rumi. I'm sharing with you two translations. One is A.J. Arbery. A.J. Arbery was a professor at Cambridge, and he is known as a fair scholar. I have not heard about any misinterpretation of Rumi by A.J. Arbery. And then we will see how Colemanberg translate a particular sentence from Rumi. So if you can look at the chat box, the first one is by Arbery. Whoever asks you about the houris, show your face and say like this. This is Arbery. And then you look at Colemanberg's, how he translates. If anyone asks you how the perfect satisfaction of all our sexual wanting will look, lift your face and say like this. If you have noticed, in this translation, the word huri is missing. Hur is a Quranic term. And in Islamic teachings, we know that hur will be there in Jannah. So when you mention hur, there is some kind of Islamic association. But Colemanberg totally deleted this Islamic association from this particular line. So this is how he distorted Maulana Jalaluddin Mahmudumi's poetry. Now, in the article that I referred to earlier, Rosina Ali says that Colemanberg kept references to Jesus and Joseph, that means Isa alayhi salam and Yusuf alayhi salam. But when Rosina Ali asked him, how come you deleted all Islamic references? Then Colemanberg said, I was brought up Presbyterian. I used to memorize Bible verses, and I know the New Testament more than I know the Quran. And he added, the Quran is hard to read. So since the Quran is hard to read, he deleted all references to the Quran in Rumi's poetry, or most references to the Quran in Rumi's poetry. Now I give you another example how Colemanberg distorted the the poetry of Rumi, and how he deleted Islamic references in Rumi's poetry. Here is another example. It says, out beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there is a field. I will meet you there. So if you actually, it was Iman and Kufr, but he translated Iman into right doing and Kufr into wrongdoing. To some extent, this is correct, but when you translate Iman into right doing, you remove the Islamic reference, because Iman is an Islamic term and Kufr is a Quranic term. So Rumi was talking about Iman and Kufr from Islamic perspectives. not from a secular perspective. But when you translate Iman into right doing and Kufr into wrongdoing, you delete, you erase the Islamic reference. So there are hundreds of such examples in Coleman Burke's translation, how he erased Islamic references in Rumi's poetry. I have done some research on the translation of Rumi, and I have found these two groups of translators. And I have questioned about one group, but the other group are reasonably fair and reliable. These are the two groups of translators. The first one is Reynold Nicholson, A.J. Arbery, and Anne-Marie Shimei. And these are the people who actually made Rumi famous earlier. And I am not aware of any allegation of misrepresentation of Rumi in their writing. So they tried their best to present Rumi as he is to the Western world, mainly through translation. Nicholson and Arbery, they are British scholars, and Anne-Marie Shimei was a German scholar who died about 10 years ago. Not 10 years, I think in 2005 or around that time she died. And then I have found another three translators of Rumi, Coleman Burks, Deepak Chopra, and Daniel Ledinsky. So I have questions about their translation of Rumi. They may not be very reliable in their translation of Rumi. Now, I will discuss few things in the next half an hour. In my first discussion, I will show you how in Rumi's poetry, he transmits the message of Quran. Rumi actually transmits the message of the Quran through poetry. And that is obvious in his poetry. He is actually spreading the message of Islam through poetry. And in order to identify Islamic messages, Quranic messages in Rumi's poetry, one has to know the Quran. Otherwise, that person will not be able to relate Rumi to the Quran or to relate Quran to Rumi. And Rosina Ali in her article says that Rumi was a Hafizul Quran. He memorized the Quran. So that's why in his poetry, Quran is indirectly everywhere. And I will base my discussion on a poem that is translated by Reynold Nicholson. And Reynold Nicholson, with all his sincerity, he identified only one Quranic verse in a poem of 122 lines. But I have identified dozens of Quranic verses in those 122 lines. So I will go very fast so that we can discuss some other things. I will also discuss two of his short stories, if possible, inshallah. So my knowledge of the Quran is not vast. I have my own limitation, and I am not depending on the Rumi's Persian text, original Persian text. I am depending on Reynold Nicholson's translation. Even in this translation, there are so many Quranic verses which are obvious. For example, in the poem, Rumi says, "One I seek, one I know, one I see, one I call." So he is actually talking about Tawheed. One I seek, one I know, one I see, one I call. Can't we relate it to Surah Al-Ikhlas? Can't we relate it to Quranic, some other Quranic verses like Ayatul Kursi? So, but a person like Coleman Burks will say one I seek, by one I seek, Rumi refers to Shamsita Bridge, or he refers to his beloved, perhaps a woman. So which is not the case. Rumi is actually talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this line. And then another very obvious Quranic reference in his poem is, he is the first. Let me share with you. And not to find the Quran in this line is surprising. It's surprising that people cannot find references to the Quran in Rumi's poetry. Rumi says, he is the first, he is the last, he is the outward, he is the inward. This is a literal translation of a Quranic verse of Surah Al-Hadid, verse 3. وَالْأَوَّلُ وَالْآخِرُ وَالظَّاهِرُ وَالْبَاطِنُ وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ and he has وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. So هُوَ الْأَوَّلُ وَالْآخِرُ وَالظَّاهِرُ وَالْبَاطِنُ. He is the first, he is the last, he is the outward, he is the inward. This is so obvious that this is a literal translation of verse 3 of Surah Al-Hadid. But neither Coleman Burke nor Reynold Nicholson was able to identify this Quranic verse in Rumi's poetry. And this is surprising. And Rumi says in his poem that I have no business save carouse and revelry. I shared this in the chat box. I have no business save carouse and revelry. So carouse and revelry, these are two terms to express happiness, extreme happiness. So Rumi says that when I love Allah, I devote myself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I accept Allah as my ultimate goal. In such a situation, I have nothing to worry. Perhaps Rumi is referring to a Quranic statement that appears again and again, فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. People who have accepted Allah as their final goal, they have no reason to fear, they have nothing to worry. So, and Rumi says in his poetic language, I have no business save carouse and revelry. But people like Coleman Burke will never find the Quran in this kind of sentence from Rumi. Now, I will discuss few more examples of Quranic references in Rumi. Rumi says in his poem, the poem that I referred to, he says, thou wert first, and last thou shalt be. Make my last better than my first. In the first line, he is talking about Allah. Oh Allah, you are my first and you are my last. Then he is saying, make my last better than my first. He is perhaps referring to the Quranic verse, وَلَلْ آخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى. وَلَلْ آخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى. Or he is perhaps referring to the statement of Umar radiallahu anhu. He said that Prophet Muhammad said, and Ibn Umar said that Prophet Muhammad said, one whose 2 days are equal is a loser. As a Muslim, our job is to continuously to progress. Our job is to try to be higher in our status on a regular basis. So Rumi is praying to Allah, oh Allah, make my last better than my first, make my future better than my past. So Rumi is saying, oh Allah, make my future better than my past. Walal akhiratu khairul laka minal ula. Now I will refer to one or two uh, uh, lines, and then I will move on to his to a stanza that I want all of us to read. Rumi says in this poem that, look now, here is a bargain. Give one life and receive 100. Look now, here is a bargain. Give one life and receive 100. Perhaps Rumi is referring to a number of Quranic verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regards our relationship with him like a contract, like a business deal, like a bargain. Like Allah says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, hal adullukum ala tijarati. Tijara means bargain, a kind of business deal. Shall I direct you to a business deal? So Rumi is saying the same thing. Look now, here is a bargain. That we have a bargain with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have a business deal, a contract with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is so beneficial. It is so profitable. This business deal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so profitable that you give one life and you receive 100. You devote one life and in return you receive hundreds of rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the reward that we receive from Allah is immeasurable. It's immeasurable. We cannot measure. So Rumi is perhaps referring to all those Quranic verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regards the relationship between him and us as a business deal, as a bargain. Now, another line, Rumi says, cease to behave as wolves and dogs. Cease to behave as wolves and dogs. Stop behaving like animals. Perhaps he is referring to the Quranic verse of Surah Al-A'raf, verse 179. Allah says, most certainly have we destined for hell many of jinns and humans who have hearts with which they fail to grasp the truth. Lahum qulubun la yafqahuna biha, and eyes with which they fail to see. Walahum a'yunun la yubsiruna biha, and ears with which they fail to hear. And then Allah says, they are like animals. Ulaika kal an'am bal hum adal. No, they are even worse than animals. So Rumi is perhaps referring to this Quranic verse and telling us not to behave like animals, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admonishes us in this verse. Now, I will go to the end of the poem that I am reading. This is called a love poem, his love poem. And at the end of the poem, Rumi has some strong message for all of us. And I believe all of us should heed to this message. I am going to share with you the screen now. I want all of us to read this together. Rumi says, I died as mineral and became a plant. I died as plant and rose to animal. I died as animal and I was man. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? Yet once more I shall die as man to soar with angels blessed. But even from angelhood I must pass on. All except God doth perish. When I have sacrificed my angel soul, I shall become what no mind ever conceived. Oh, let me not exist, for non-existence proclaims in organ tones, to him we shall return. So what Rumi says in this stanza is that the life of a Muslim is a story of continuous progression. The life of a Muslim is a story of continuous progression. A Muslim cannot be complacent. A Muslim cannot be sedentary. A Muslim cannot be happy with what he has already achieved. A Muslim must strive, must struggle to thrive, to reach the high as possible. And Rumi says, I died as animal. He died here not necessarily physical death. Here it may mean that I struggled. I struggled as mineral, and mineral something that is inorganic. Then I became a plant. That means I have improved my status from mineral to plant. I died as plant and rose to animal. And then I continued to struggle as plant, and then I elevated my status to animal. I died as animal and I was man. And when I was in the status of animal, I continued to struggle. I sacrificed. Then I became a human being. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? Rumi says, as a Muslim, I have no fear. Why shall I fear? Because for a Muslim, it's a profitable business. Whether I suffer or not, my reward is with Allah. When I suffer, I struggle, I remain patient, Allah elevates my status. That's why he says, when was I less by dying? When was I a loser by sacrificing, by struggling? Yet once more I shall die as man, to soar with angels blessed. He said, no, when I have arrived the status of human being, I will not stop, I will continue. I'll continue to struggle, I'll continue to try, and I will soar, I will climb to the status of angels, blessed angels. But even from angelhood, I must pass on. Then Rumi says, no, I will not stop even at the stage of angelhood. I must pass on. All except God doth perish. And when I have sacrificed my angel soul, I shall become what no mind ever conceived. And when I have sacrificed and I have struggled from the status of angel, I will attain a status that no human being could ever imagine. So that is what Rumi's message to all of us, that as Muslims, all of us must struggle, must sacrifice to continuously elevate our status, not remain complacent or sedentary or static. Unfortunately, most Muslims in today's world are opposite. We are complacent, we are sedentary, we are static. We tend to commemorate the past glories of our ancestors. We sometimes feel happy that our ancestors facilitated scientific invention. They rescued European scholarship and this and that. They did this and that, and this is how we feel complacent. But we are not struggling to elevate our status. If we were heedful of this message of Rumi, then Coleman Burks would not be able to distort his message. Why Coleman Burke and others have been able to distort the message of Rumi through translation? Because we Muslims did not do the right thing. We Muslims did not translate his work and disseminate them. That's why there was a gap, a vacuum, and people like Coleman Burke, they simply filled in. So I personally do not blame Coleman Burke and this and that. I blame Muslims first, because we have not done our job. If we were careful, if we are more hardworking, then perhaps our translation would be everywhere, would be more widespread than the translation of Coleman Burke. So, and the Rumi says, oh, let me not exist. For non-existence proclaims in organ tones to him, I'm not scared of death. Why shall I be scared of death? Because if I die, I will return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To him we shall return. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. And Reynold Nicholson only identified this sentence from the Quran. And as I have said earlier, there are dozens of Quranic references in this poem of 122 lines, but Reynold Nicholson has been able to identify only one. So this is about Rumi's poetry. As I said earlier, when we study Rumi, when we read Rumi's translation, we need to check the source. We need to check the translator. Who is the translator? And I have given you three names whose translation I rely on and I appreciate their work. A.J. Arbery, Reynold Nicholson, and Anne-Marie Schimmel. And I gave you three other names, Deepak Chopra, and then Coleman Burks and Ladinsky, whose translation of Rumi is questionable. So we need to be careful, as Allah said in the Quran, "In ja'akum fasiqun binaba'in fatabayyanu." When a fasik, an iniquitous person, comes to us with a piece of information, we need to investigate. And with Rumi's poetry, we need to apply the same strategy, the same approach, so that we and our Muslim brothers and sisters are not misguided by wrong translation of Rumi. Now I want to share with you two short story by Rumi, and these two short stories are very meaningful. They are very meaningful, and I hope you will like it very much, inshallah. Okay. One story is, the title is The Greek and the Chinese Artist, on the difference between theologians and mystics. Rumi narrates a story involving two groups of artists, the Greek artist and the Chinese artist. These two groups of artists were arguing with each other. They said, "We are the better artists," the Chinese declared. And the Greek said, "We have the edge on you. No, we are better." So the Greek and the Chinese artists were arguing that they are better artists. Eventually, both the groups went to the Sultan, to the king. And the king said that it's easy to decide who are better artists. You simply show me your artwork and I will tell you whose art is better. Then both the groups said, okay, we need a room, give us a room, and on the wall we will paint, we will do our artwork. Okay, so the Sultan gave both of them a very big hall. In the hall, on the two sides of the hall, on the two walls, they will do their painting, they will do their artwork. When the Sultan gave them this big hall, the Greek artists, they said, no, we need a partition. We need to divide the hall into two. We need a partition. We need a curtain to divide. And then the Chinese artist said, okay, we are fine with that. Then the Chinese artists, they kept asking for different colors from the Sultan. We need this color, that color, and the Sultan told his finance minister that you give them whatever they want. So the Chinese artists kept asking for different colors for their painting. Conversely, the Greek artists did not ask for a single color. They did not ask for anything. What they were doing? They were simply cleaning the wall. They were scrubbing the wall very clean. They did no art on the wall. They simply cleaned the wall. Okay. Finally, the Chinese artist said to the Sultan that our work is done. You can come to visit and see our artwork. And then the Greek artist said, okay, our work is also done. Now the Sultan first went to the Chinese side to see their artwork, and he was amazed by the beauty of their artwork. They did very well on the wall, and he was fascinated. Then he came to the other side, to the side of the Greek artist. And when he came to the Greek artist, he found no painting on the wall. And the Sultan said, where are your work? Where are your painting? What they did, they said, okay, we are showing you our painting. They simply removed the curtain. They simply removed the partition. And when they removed the partition in the middle of the hall, all the artwork, all the painting of the Chinese side was reflected on the Greek wall. And when it was reflected, it looked so much more beautiful than the original work. So through this story, Maulana Rumi is conveying a very strong message, a very meaningful message to all of us, that in life, in order for us to thrive, we may not need all these accessories. We may not need all these luxuries, all these expensive houses and expensive cars. In life, in order for us to be successful, what we need is a clean heart. If we can clean our heart, we can get rid of many, many accessories in our life. Some people have so many in their life, but their output, their contribution to knowledge, their contribution to society is minimum. Some other people have a very simple life. They are very humble. They lead a very simple life, but they contribute a lot. That depends on the condition of our heart, on the condition of our intention. If we intend well, we will thrive. We will achieve so much. But if we are busy with this and that, accessories, expensive mobile phones, expensive cars, expensive houses, holiday making, and this and that, we may not be able to contribute much. So I find this story very meaningful. And Rumi conveys the message that what is important in a Muslim's life to thrive, to succeed, is the purity of the heart. You clean your heart from all sorts of impurities, all sorts of filth, as Imam Ghazali says, al-muhlikat, the destructive elements, arrogance, pride, self-conceit, conceit, and then self-importance, egotism. If we can delete all these moral diseases from our heart, then we will be able to thrive so much. I had another story. The title is The Sufi and the Fakhi and the Sharif, and how their solidarity was destroyed. I don't think we'll be able to discuss this story. This story is also very important, where Maulana Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi tells us the importance of remaining united. If we remain united, we will remain strong. And if we are disunited, our enemies will deal with us one by one. And then we will suffer. So that is also a very meaningful story. I will share this with you through Brother Shaharan. We have 7 minutes left. So I hope we can discuss some questions or contributions or comments in these 7 minutes, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you so much, Prof. Such a very interesting discussion. I really like the story about the Greek and the Chinese artists. So, okay, we open for questions, brother. The next one, who will be
In the next class, we'll discuss Muhammad Iqbal.
Oh, okay, okay. So I meant to ask about Ibn Arabi. Are they the same time or are they related?
Ibn Arabi, I'm not sure. Obviously before Iqbal, but maybe after Rumi. I'll need to check.
Okay, this brother Nuruddin question. Can you read that from the chat box?
Brother, okay, I have. Is it true that Rumi specifically writes poetry which contains philosophical message? Because for Rumi, if he uses ordinary language, he will not be able to accommodate the depth of philosophy he wants to express. Obviously, as I said earlier, Rumi was a polymath. So in his poetry, we see many things, not only philosophy. But some of his writings are very simple. For example, these two stories, the Chinese and the Greek artist, and the Sufi and the Fakhi and the Sharif, these are very simple. The language is pretty ordinary. So obviously, some of his poetry is of he uses sophisticated language. That is because of his poetic genius. I don't believe he deliberately made it difficult for people to understand. And obviously, philosophy and literature are interrelated. In any literary work, you will see philosophy. So this is very common. And the second question is, in a number of articles, it is stated that in some parts of the poetry, Rumi tends to support homosexuality. Is this part of the mistranslation of Rumi's? I am aware of this debate. This is again the poem that I was discussing. We did not discuss the whole poem. In this poem, Rumi talks about Shamsi Tabriz. So in a world where homosexuality is very common, and people find it difficult to think logically that there can be a relationship between two men without any reference to sex. So people who are obsessed with homosexuality, who cannot imagine a healthy relationship between two men, will jump to the conclusion that Rumi was a homosexual. And they say this in relation to Shamsi Tabriz, which I find ridiculous, which I find unacceptable. Rumi was simply expressing his gratitude to Shamsi Tabriz because it was through Shamsi Tabriz that he found the Sufi way of reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rumi was a Sufi in a good sense. He was a mystic. He used to do dhikr. He used to remember Allah much. And he found this way of attaining Allah's pleasure through Shamsi Tabriz. And that is why he simply expresses his gratitude in his poem to Shamsi Tabriz, not in a homosexual way. So this is very unfair to Rumi. And I understand people who interpret Rumi that way because they cannot conceive, they cannot imagine a healthy relationship between two men without sexual connotation. It is interesting about Rumi's message that we must continue to improve from time to time. Was this poem raised by Rumi when at that time the Muslims were in a state of stagnation? For example, because of the attacks of the Mongol? Perhaps, very much true. That was the time when Muslims were suffering a lot. Baghdad in 1258 was a massacre. the full of Baghdad was full of blood, and the river Tigris was full of ink of the scholars and the blood of the scholars. So perhaps Rumi was encouraging Muslims to elevate themselves, to keep struggling and to keep trying. And he said, with trying, we will continue to grow, we'll continue to thrive, inshallah. Another question, Prof, your thought on why the Western translator minimize the presence of Quranic. Obviously, in Coleman Burke's translation, it was prejudice. He perhaps has problems with Islam and Muslims. And obviously, he said that he finds the Quran difficult. That's why he doesn't want to make references to the Quran. So with Coleman Burke's, it's obvious his prejudice is mixed with ignorance. Prejudice mixed with ignorance. But there are other scholars who we should appreciate. For example, A.J. Arbery and Anne-Marie Schimmel and Raynon Nicholson. They are fair scholars. They have limitations. For example, Raynon Nicholson identified only one Quranic verse in a poem of 122 lines, whereas I, with my limited knowledge of the Quran, have identified dozens of Quranic references. One obvious one is wal awwal wal akhir wal zahir wal batin. My short answer to this is prejudice mixed with ignorance was the reason why they removed Islamic references from his poetry. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, Prof, a final word for tonight.
My final word tonight is I am very focused on my research. And I believe that for people like us, all of us in this forum, we should focus on research. We should focus on our homework. If we work hard and if we can produce alternative translation of Rumi, an alternative translation of all other great Islamic writers, then our translation will be widespread and people will accept our translation. But if we are busy with accessories, with trivial things, like organizing webinars and becoming famous overnight, these will not solve our problem. We need some people who will devote themselves to scholarship, who will not worry about recognition, who will not worry about appreciation and praise from other people. They will focus on their scholarship, they will produce their work, and they will expect their rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Only then we can challenge, we can contest this kind of misrepresentation of Rumi. Otherwise, if we are complacent and live our life as it is, I don't see any hope. And you can imagine how many people are being misguided by the translation of Coleman Burke's and others. And if we do not work hard and if we do not present alternative translation, then this will continue.
Thank you so much, Prof. This is a must to all of us, especially now that we have this open access to the internet and things that the quality work must be there.
Yes.
As an alternative to all of this garbage on the internet. Thank you so much, Prof. See you next week. We look forward.
Next week we'll discuss Muhammad Iqbal, inshallah.
Okay, everyone. We'll see everyone in other classes, inshallah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.